Hello, I'm Volker Runke. For the third volume in my Levian campaign series for GMT Games, I invited Italian military historian and game designer Enrico Acerbi to join me to bring Levian campaign to medieval Italy. Enrico chose to set our game in the conflict that led to the bloodiest of battles, Monteperti, fought in 1260 near the city of Siena. We call our design Inferno. Guelphs and Ghibellines vie for Tuscany, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the game and the era that it depicts. Inferno has all the military activity that you would expect of Levian campaign. Muster and service of lords, supply, forage and ravage, battle and siege, storm and sack. As well, Inferno takes us into the world of Italian communal politics that surrounded war in Tuscany. Exiles, revolt, treachery and bribery, captives and ransom. In this video, I'll talk about who the Guelphs and the Ghibellines were and why these two parties, of the same religion and ethnicity, fought one another so viciously. And I will reveal just some of Inferno's features that aim to bring to life particular political and cultural aspects of medieval Italian warfare in order more fully to tell its tale of Guelph versus Ghibelline. Northern Italy in the 13th century occupied a leading edge in economic development. It had seen a new rise of its cities through trades such as cloth-making and finance. Florentines, for example, profited richly as bankers to the Pope. Commercial and therefore military power was shifting from rural feudal lords to towns and cities who had the wherewithal to secure themselves behind stout walls manned by well-drilled and well-equipped citizens. Wealthy families who might or might not be of noble ancestry ran these urban communities, in Italian, comuni. Unfortunately, true to medieval fashion, these great urban houses, in their taste for power, inevitably turned upon one another. Because the region fell nominally under the rule of German Holy Roman emperors, local conflicts among families, neighboring towns, or commercial competitors, such as the great cities of Florence, Firenze, and Siena, coalesced over time into warfare between two broad political parties, the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. These two groups differed in their posture toward imperial influence. Ghibellines favored loyalty to the emperor. The word Ghibellini was an Italianization of the German place name Weiblingen, the main stronghold of the dominant imperial dynasty, the Hohenstaufen. Guelphs, or Guelfi, after the German Welf or Wolf, names of German rivals of the Hohenstaufen, backed these German imperial challengers and the key rival in Italy to the emperor, the Pope. While Ghibellines generally stood for order and Guelphs for liberty, and they might fight for the emperor or for the Pope, the fundamental political conflict remained local. Comuni lords and citizens battled each other not over which prince or high priest might claim some foreign land, but over who among them would run things inside their own town, indeed in their own neighborhoods. By the mid-1200s, competing alliances divided Tuscany under the leading city-state of Firenze to the north and east, facing off against Siena to the south and west. In the late 1250s, the Guelph families of Firenze seized control of the city and kicked out its Ghibellines, pressed Florentine dominion over nearby towns, and sealed pacts with other Guelph cities such as Arezzo and Lucca. Lucca's local rival, the great naval power Pisa, in turn allied with Ghibelline Siena, while Firenze's Ghibelline exiles sheltered in Siena and there egged their hosts on. Fighting escalated as both sides called in outside support. Sienna's Ghibellines invited help from the Hohenstaufen imperial house. Firenze's Guelphs called to the Papal States, led by the town of Orvieto, and to a Guelph League that had just closed its grip on northern Italy and stood ready to send an army south into Tuscany under the Florentine noble Guido Guerraguidi. Siena's appeals happened to coincide with an imperial succession crisis, in which the Italian-raised Manfred Hohenstaufen, or Manfredi, had usurped rule of the Kingdom of Sicily, which spanned southern Italy. Manfredi now sought to expand his grip up the peninsula northward. In 1259, he sent his Count Giordano de Aliano and several hundred tough German knights, Ritter, to bolster the Hohenstaufen loyalists of Siena against what he saw as a rebel Guelph Firenze. The stage was set for a great showdown between these two Tuscan and foreign alliances. Inferno's game map divides the territory of each alliance, Firenze's Guelphs and Siena's Ghibellines, by a rather subdued dashed line. It means to evoke fluidity in the competing Guelph and Ghibelline claims and loyalties. Set up for a scenario, the board here and there bears gold Ghibelline and purple Guelph allegiance markers. These are strongholds in revolt within each side's claimed territory, a key aspect of gameplay to which we will return soon. As we saw, military power in medieval Tuscany emanated increasingly from within its cities as much as from traditional lords out on the land. The nature of these urban armies calls in Inferno for some new Levian campaign mechanics. Inferno features a new type of lord called a podestà, meaning a mayor or magistrate. Tuscan cities commonly appointed such a podestà, often an outsider so as not to favor any of the city's particular notables, to administer the city's affairs, including war. 6 of the game's 12 lords represent such urban magistrates, with the following special attributes. First, a podestà lord never permanently disbands. A city could always appoint a new mayor. Instead, in reaction to any military misfortune that might remove a podestà's army, a city-state suffers greater revolt and treachery penalties than do feudal lords in the game. More later on how that works. Second, it costs twice the usual coin to extend a podestà's service, because a well-to-do city's muster for war interrupts especially lucrative commerce. At the same time, taxing a rich city likewise yields twice the usual coin in the game. Third, podestà lords possess a main seat at their city, along with other seats, with special implications for muster of the city's urban army. Let me illustrate the urban army rules. Here, Firenze's army is besieging Pisa. A podestà can muster and use his lordship to levy from inside his city even if besieged. Here, urban army means that the podestà of Pisa can be mustered into the siege and later even use his lordship to add to his forces there. The bulk of Pisa's troops and equipment are coming from within the city's walls. If the city is under attack, a podestà is always ready to muster, regardless of where his cylinder is on the calendar. Emergency army means that, with an enemy lord at Pisa's main seat, Pisa's podestà is ready to muster even with his cylinder some turns ahead on the calendar. The enemy are at the gates. Form up the militia. No time to dally. However, a podestà's army becomes harder to muster if his main seat is lost to the enemy. Exile army means that, should the Florentines conquer the city of Pisa before its podestà is able to muster, the Pisans can still raise their army at another seat, such as at Pontedera, but it will cost 2 levy actions rather than 1 for each fealty roll to do so. Exiles from Pisa can gather at a safe stronghold, but not as readily as at home. As we saw, the powerful rival city-states of Firenze and Siena led the Guelph and Ghibelline alliances, respectively. In Inferno, Firenze and Siena are special leading cities. Their podestal lords are commanders who, like marshals in Nevsky or Almoravid, can bring other lords along on a march. Also, each leading city's podesta has a second cylinder and mat to accommodate a full call to arms of the city-state's oversized communal army. You may recall that the game Almoravid handled its giant host of African troops by splitting the historically unified Almoravitun army between two lords, Yusuf and Sir. In Inferno, a Comune cylinder stacks under and moves with its commander, much as Lieutenant and Lower Lord do in the earlier games. Commander and Comune still count as a single lord for command actions, but each cylinder counts as an added lord for placing siege markers at an enemy stronghold, and their two mats each occupy their own spot in a battle or storm array. The Comune forces come into play by an entirely new call to arms routine, war. If one side is behind by enough in the game, or if either side happens to draw a war event, that side can declare a mutual call to arms that proceeds as follows. First, the Guelphs or the Ghibellines can gather their field armies nearer their leading city, that is, Firenze or Siena. Then, that leading city may remuster its commander afresh. Next, if inside the city, the commander can muster its extra Comune mat with its forces, a war chest of coin, and a baggage train of carts. Finally, a side can add yet more allies via free muster of or by any one lord. The kick is, call to arms, if triggered, is mutual. The enemy populace can react to your escalation. Now let's have a quick look at the composition of these Italian communal armies through new special vassal and unit types. The Comune mats hold troops of urban districts, Sestieri for Firenze and Terzi for Siena, that usually require die rolls to muster, but do so automatically in a call to arms. The Comuni also muster a city's carroccio, a sacred ox wagon that embodies the Comune's civic pride. It gives benefit in battle, but it costs victory points if captured. Units in the game depict the characteristics of troops that these Italian cities raised. Cavalieri horse units represent noble and non-noble heavy horse, numerous but by reputation not as stalwart and hard-hitting as the full-time professionals represented by the German Ritter. Similarly numerous Armigeri, foot, are not quite the professional soldiers of our more familiar men-at-arms, but drilled and well-equipped they can better stand against a charge than the hastily formed and unarmored militia we have come to know. The Vilici foot units joining the Comune represent urban laborers and are akin to serfs of earlier games. Barravieri horse are a type of constable, known mainly for their eagerness for loot. Finally, an example of capability cards relating to the art of war in medieval Tuscany. Comuni organized specialist teams of shieldmen and spearmen to protect their crossbowmen from enemy horse and missiles while reloading. In the game, Armigeri, equipped with large Pavese shields, Palvesari, become very tough indeed, and Balistrieri crossbowmen teamed with them are deadly accurate. But as each lord can only receive the usual 2 This Lord capability cards, it will take dedicated levying to knit Palvesari and Balistrieri together for combat. I described earlier how Guelph and Ghibelline factions divided their communities from within. In Italy today, you can still see physical evidence of these internal rivalries from centuries ago. Medieval Italians fortified their towns and cities not only against outside threats, but along their own streets, as families sought to overawe their neighbors with giant towers, such as these I snapped in Bologna. In the little hilltop town of San Gimignano, So many of these family towers survive that tour guides have nicknamed the place the medieval Manhattan. In the 1200s, when one side conquered another, it typically would tear down such towers, gates, walls, or family castles in order to demonstrate its power and seal its dominion. In Inferno, when you sack a stronghold, you ruin it rather than conquering it, awarding just one half a victory point against the side who owns the surrounding territory and eliminating the stronghold until rebuilt. An even more important facet of Guelph-on-Ghibelline conflict resulting from the two factions' coexistence within the walls of a single town or city is that any given stronghold might change allegiance politically, from Guelph to Ghibelline and then back again, as one or the other internal faction seized control, or as its leaders decide to switch sides, either to revolt against its leading city or alternatively to recognize that city's overlordship. In these years, Tuscan towns of oscillating political loyalty became bones of contention that lured Guelphs and Ghibellines into major military campaigns. When the town of Cortona revolted against the Guelph city of Arezzo in 1259, it drew a swift and brutal military response. Prolonged resistance to Ghibelline Siena from its hinterland towns of Montalcino and Montepulciano became a casus belli for Sienese and Florentine campaigns that climaxed tragically at Monteperti in 1260. In Inferno, Guelph and Ghibelline 1VP allegiance markers replace Levian campaign's conquered markers to show which strongholds on either side of the line are in rebellion. Here we see Volterra, within ostensibly Ghibelline territory, in revolt against Sienese domination, and likewise Poggio Bonizio in revolt against Firenze. The only difference between Guelph and Ghibelline markers and the old conquered VP markers is that, in this game, you will place or remove allegiance not only by surrender, but often by revolt. The movements of armies, especially their victories and defeats on the walls or on the battlefield, would ripple politically and could convince a town over here to revolt against its overlords, or rebels over there to give up and submit. A range of such occurrences in gameplay, conquest of a stronghold, removal of a lord, failure to pay captives ransom, and certain arts of war events, can induce a stronghold to revolt, to flip its allegiance one way or the other. A dedicated aid sheet summarizes how to check for such revolt. For any trigger of revolt, 2 dice on a random strongholds table, which accounts for localities' historical tendencies, combines with positioning on the map of each side's lords and of existing revolts to determine whether and where rebellion might spread. And there's a more deliberate and directed way that players can sponsor revolt in the game: treachery. Each lord has a single treachery command card. When it comes up on campaign, if that lord is at or adjacent to a valid revolt target, an enemy stronghold without any of the lords on its side nearby, he can roll for that stronghold to come over to his side, paying some coin if it agrees to do so. As you might imagine, treachery cards can be powerful. Historically, they represent opportunities obtained through triumphs, diplomacy, or special relationships. So, unlike regular command action cards in the game, players must earn treachery cards to add to their decks. They do so in a similar way as they might receive the more random revolt table rolls, and sometimes have the choice of one or the other, a random roll or a treachery card. Once committed to a campaign, a treachery card will go back out of the deck afterward. So, players must plan campaigns and maneuver lords deftly to get the most out of their treachery. Enrico reasoned that if Guelphs or Ghibellines could induce a stronghold to rebel, they similarly could bribe contingents of forces, vassals in the game, to become turncoats as well. The second use of treachery cards, then, is to steal vassal forces away from your opponent, either an unmustered vassal with treachery from nearby the vassal's seat, or a mustered vassal from nearby that enemy lord's cylinder, snatching his forces right off his mat. As with revolt by treachery, successful use of bribes calls for adroit positioning, timing, and coin. Earlier, I noted briefly the role of Florentine exiles, Ghibellines driven out of Firenze and into refuge in Siena. One such Florentine Ghibelline exile, Farinata degli Uberti, played such a large role in fomenting conflict between the alliances that Dante Alighieri, a Florentine Guelph who lived not long after these events, in his epic poem Inferno, assigned Farinata a special place in hell, as well as a lengthy imagined discourse with Dante as its visitor. Similarly, Guelph Arezzo exiled its bishop, who likewise ended up fighting for Siena, and, after Arezzo in 1259 crushed rebel Cortona, refugees from that town also fled to Siena. In the game, these exiles show up as vassals who can muster under various Ghibelline lords. Another wily insider, Bocca degli Abati, betrayed Firenze's Guelphs by hiding his true allegiance until the critical moment on the day of battle at Monteperti. Bocca, in Firenze's army, suddenly raised his sword and cut off the Florentine standard-bearer's arm, then led his contingent on an attack from within the Guelph lines that helped break them. Bocca, too, earned himself an eerie scene in Dante's Inferno, conversing with the visitor to hell on the plain of a frozen lake, frostbitten and locked up to his chin in ice for eternity. These exiles and turncoats not only fought on the battlefield, they fueled escalation of the conflict across Tuscany. When one or the other side took over a stronghold, it often would throw out the leading citizens of the other side, who would go forth to find outside backing to return themselves to power. The same happened after Siena at Monteperti in 1260 won its smashing victory. Firenze fell to the Ghibellines, but her Guelphs ran to Lucca and Arezzo, and the war dragged on into 1261. The game, in order to capture this historical dynamic, includes an exile's consolation prize for any side that loses a stronghold to revolt. That side gets to hasten the readiness or extend the service of its lords by a number of turns totaling the value of the stronghold that it lost, 1, 2, or 3. A final common characteristic of medieval warfare that Enrico and I thought deserved more explicit treatment in Inferno was the ransom of well-to-do captives. After Monteperti, to give one major example, the Ghibellines collected tens of thousands of gold florins in ransoms from all the lords, knights, and prominent Guelph citizens they had captured on the field. The affair gave rise to the tale of Usilia, a woman of Siena who had accompanied the army as a food vendor and, after the battle, endeavored to collect up 36 Guelph prisoners and lead them tied like geese to herself collect on their ransoms. You can spot Usilia and a few of her captives in the game's cover painting, an original painting by game artist Matthew Wallhead. In the game, units of knights, Italian cavalieri or German Ritter, after a sack of a garrison or after a battle, can become captives held in a box on the game board. At the end of each campaign, players must either ransom these captives back by paying coin to the opposing player's lords, or, if the captives are left to languish, suffer treachery or revolt penalties. So that's a quick take on politics in 13th century Tuscany, and how the game Inferno, from Enrico Acerbi and me, seeks to recreate Guelph versus Ghibelline politics as environment for medieval military operations. Next up, Levy and Campaign Series Volume 4 will take us to very different political dynamics, Lancastrians versus Yorkists, in designer Francisco Gradaige's Plantagenet, Cousins' War for England. Until then, I'm Volker Runke. Please enjoy the games.